is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The US Treasury Secretary promises to extend a hand to other banks with the same emergency guarantees given to Silicon Valley Bank.
Our other headlines, tens of thousands of jobs are at risk at Credit Suisse as the bank's takeover steadies the markets. We'll be assessing if the worst is now over.
And institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. A damning review of London's Metropolitan Police Force concludes it's unable to police itself.
The United States government stands ready to guarantee deposits at any smaller bank that needs it. That's the message from the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen.
She told the American Bankers Association that the situation is stabilising after the government intervened to save depositors at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank last week.
The steps we took were not focused on aiding specific banks or classes of banks. Our intervention was necessary to protect the broader U.S. banking system. And similar actions could be warranted if smaller institutions suffered deposit runs that pose the risk of contagion.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, in New York. John translates for us from the bank speak. What precisely is Yellen really saying here?
Well, Jamie and Robin, you credit me, I think. I'm not sure I can do that, really. Although, I tell you something, these people these days, Yellen and the guy over at the Federal Reserve, they do at least speak plain English. I mean, they didn't used to. Years ago, they really ran circles around everybody. Look, this was the American Bankers Association, okay? So it's a D.C.-based little membership organization for, guess what, American bankers. And they're having a mini summit in the springtime in Washington, D.C. It's a sunny day down there. It's a nice day to have it. And Janet Yellen, who was sitting in a very comfortable chair on the stage, basically used it as an opportunity to express confidence in the wider U.S. banking system. She said that what's been happening in recent weeks is all about confidence and not insolvency, and that the U.S. banks are resilient. Now, she hinted in the course of the time that she was on the stage as their guest of honor that the Treasury, of which she is the chief, and the Federal Reserve, the central bank, are ready to play a much bigger role in overseeing and helping out the banking system than they might have done just a couple of weeks ago. And the background to this is, you remember when SVB fell over, the bank in California serving Silicon Valley, just over a week ago? And then the Signature Bank in New York, which has now just been taken over, by the way, by another bank in New York. When they went down, the Biden administration said, well, we're not bailing out these banks, okay, so we're firing the management. They've gone. Investors, tough luck, you can go away. But investors will make sure that every penny you lodge with these banks, you'll be able to get it out on Monday morning, which was a week ago yesterday. And that is indeed what happened, and that calmed things a lot. Well, I don't think you can do that for two banks only. I think if you do it for two banks, you have to do it for all 4,000 of them, should they run into difficulty. And Yellen said today that she hinted anyway, I don't think she said, I didn't hear her say it directly, but there was definitely an implication there that the federal authorities could do the same if there are further bank runs. And I think that they suspect there may be some further bank runs coming up. Now, what's different about this, she was asked about this last week on Capitol Hill giving testimony, and she couldn't really give a clear answer. So I think this is quite a big change. And the signal is that any bank now, any regional bank, and there's about 20 of them apparently teetering, if they do run into difficulty, then the depositors will at least get their money back. So that's a big change. She also pointed out she didn't think this was like the 2008 financial crisis, which was when the banks were in danger of literally not being able to pay anybody. They were insolvent back then. And that's when the government stepped in to literally keep them going. She said that this is a very, very different situation, and that regional banks, which is the ones we're talking about here, not the big Wall Street names, but the regional banks, are stronger now because of legislation that was put in place after the 2008 financial crisis. Now, I know that some say it's been diluted recently, but nonetheless, that was the Treasury Secretary's message.
John, Janet Yellen's messaging is perhaps the easy bit in a sense, important though it is. Meanwhile, it is worth saying there are banks still teetering, are there not?
Yes, there are, and we know this because Moody's, the credit rating agency, has told us this. There are at least, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and about 20, depending on how far you want to take it, which are teetering. And I'll tell you why, just in one sentence. The problem is that because this has all been highlighted now, people are keen to take their money out of these regional banks dotted all over the country and put them in the big Wall Street names. And you can't really blame them for doing it. And it doesn't cost them anything to do it, and some of them could do it with the press of a key on a keyboard, literally. So if it doesn't cost them anything to do that, and these big banks here on Wall Street are safer, why wouldn't you? That's why we're expecting there to be more regional banks which suffer. Now, the one that's suffering most at the moment, or at least was until yesterday, is First Republic. That's top of the list, based in San Francisco. It's the one that was rescued by an amazing, never-before-seen coalition, a rescue coalition of 11 big banks put together by Jamie Dimon at JP Chase. And they put $30 billion into First Republic on Friday. And then on Friday night, the New York Times began reporting that actually the bank needs even more money. And so yesterday, Monday, its stock was halted several times. It ended yesterday down 47%. That's a lot. And it's down more than 0.5% in just a week. Well, now today, because of what Yellen said, and only because of what Yellen said, First Republic shares are up 41% now, at around $17 each. And now it is all eyes on Wednesday. The Federal Reserve is meeting, and in one sentence to help you understand, they'll make a decision at 18 GMT tomorrow, Wednesday. And here's the thing. Wall Street thinks it'll be a 25 basis point hike. We thought it might be no hike at all, but now the thinking here is if they do that, people will say that they've been spooked by something. What do they know that we don't know? And so that's why I think it's going to be a 25 basis point hike, pretty much the minimum that they can do in order to go on combating inflation, which is still very high and still really the main problem here. Guys?
John, we'll talk again tomorrow on that subject. For the moment, our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
Bank stocks in Europe and Asia have risen slightly after the weekend takeover of Credit Suisse by UBS. $3.2 billion buyout of Switzerland's iconic bank have eased fears of contagion. But some investors have expressed anger that the deal wrote off $17 billion worth of bonds, many of them held by retail investors in Asia. Tens of thousands of jobs at Credit Suisse and UBS are thought to be at risk.
The European Court of Justice has ruled that Mercedes-Benz must pay drivers compensation for unauthorised so-called defeat devices in diesel cars if the buyer suffers damages. Defeat devices are mechanisms that can change emission levels, leading to disputes over whether manufacturers use them to mask the true pollution levels of their cars. The ECJ says it's up to German courts to decide whether the software in question qualifies as a defeat device and whether its use is justified.
The Chinese electric car manufacturer BYD is reducing shifts at 2 of its plants, according to Reuters. Some workers at its Xi'an hub are reportedly moving to a 4-day week, whilst the Shenzhen factory is said to be moving from 3 shifts a day to 2. This comes as BYD, which declined to comment, where there's a slowdown in domestic demand.
China's multinational car giant Geely Holdings has posted record revenues for last year, a 45% jump to $21.5 billion. Geely, which owns brands including Volvo, Proton and Lotus, also saw an 8.5% rise in profits, the first increase in 5 years. It's forecasting more growth based on heavy investment in electric vehicles.
Sri Lanka is set to receive $330 million from the International Monetary Fund in the next 2 days, the first portion of a nearly $3 billion bailout from the global lender. The country defaulted on its foreign debt last year as it plunged into its worst economic crisis in 7 decades. It triggered protests which overthrew the government.
Google has suspended the Chinese online shopping app Pinduoduo from its Play Store over alleged security concerns. It said malware had been detected on versions of the app outside the Google platform. Pinduoduo has been seeking to boost its market share among young shoppers in the United States, including running ads at the Super Bowl. The Chinese retail giant said it rejects allegations its app is malicious and is seeking more information from Google.
London's Metropolitan Police Force is institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic and unable to police itself. Those are the damning findings of an independent review which has suggested that the force could be broken up if it fails to reform. Our correspondent Michael Voss reports.
Baroness Louise Case's review into the quality of policing in London is the most damning report ever produced, highlighting a prevalent culture of blindness, arrogance and prejudice within the Metropolitan Police Force.
I essentially turned my attention to 4 tests of whether the Met is institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic. And in a way I've done that in order to show everybody, including the Met, that there is a way out of this, that change is possible.
It was the mass protest following the abduction, rape and murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer which prompted the review. The heavy-handed police reaction arresting women attending a vigil also focused attention on sexism within the force. The report points to the extremely poor conviction rates for rape. Racism is another problem highlighted, with the report finding that stop and search and use of force against black people was excessive.
No justice!
It's not the first such review. The Macpherson report back in 1999 called the police institutionally racist, yet little was done amid claims it was just a few bad apples in the force. The other side of the report looks at how female, ethnic minority and LBGT police are treated by fellow officers. The findings point to widespread problems. Sir Mark Rowley came out of retirement 6 months ago to head the Metropolitan Police with a brief to push through change. He doesn't accept the institutional failures, but agrees the problems are systemic.
It's not simply the ghastly fact that we have racists, misogynists and homophobes in the organisation, but actually it's also about we've got systemic failings, management failings, cultural failings.
Trust in the police has been hugely damaged by the things that we've discovered over the
Even
past year.
your trust?
Everybody's trust, but what we need to do is now make sure that that won't be repeated, that we can regain people's trust. And I know that the police commissioner is committed to doing that.
Commissioner Rowley has initiated a 5-year plan to clean up the police. The report, though, warns that if progress isn't rapidly made, then London's police force may have to be split up. Michael Voss, CGTN, London.
So, Michael, as you said, a truly damning report. Yes. Where does the force go from here?
Well, it's about restoring trust, which is going to be a very difficult problem. Part of this is getting rid of those officers that shouldn't be there. That may require changes to the rules to make it easier, and also a new vetting system for new recruits. Now, there is going to be an independent oversight committee looking at this, headed by the London Mayor. Other recommendations include a dedicated women's protection service, and also disbanding the diplomatic and parliamentary armed police units. The officer who murdered Sarah Everard and another officer who's been convicted of rape both came from these units. So there's recommendations that that unit is disbanded rather than the entire police force.
I mean, we've heard a lot in your report and the official report about the Met's failings on racism and homophobia. But what about the Met's record on policing and clearing up crime?
Well, I think you have to remember that in the last decade or so of austerity, there have been 20,000 less police officers in this country, which has affected their efficiency. It's also meant that other services going down, police are spending much more time dealing with things like mental health problems that other services should be dealing with. Now, what we can say is that just 6% of burglaries are solved at the moment, less than 5% of vehicle thefts suspects are caught, and only 1% of rape cases that have been reported to the police are actually lead to charges, let alone a conviction. So there are a lot of really serious problems to get the policing back up to where it should be.
Michael, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Michael Voss.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, protests continue in France as President Macron prepares to speak for the first time since driving through those controversial pension reforms.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Our top stories. The US Treasury Secretary promises to extend a hand to other banks with the same emergency guarantees given to Silicon Valley Bank.
Our other headlines, tens of thousands of jobs are at risk at Credit Suisse as the bank's takeover steadies the markets.
And institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. A damning review of London's Metropolitan Police Force concludes it's unable to police itself.
France's President Emmanuel Macron will appear on the country's leading television channels on Wednesday in his first media appearance since the government forced its pension reform through Parliament last week.
Protesters opposing plans to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 have once again clashed with riot police. It comes after another night of demonstrations in France. Our correspondent Ross Cullen reports from Paris.
More violence on the streets across France on Monday night, police firing tear gas in the northern city of Lille as anger over the government's pension reform shows no sign of easing. Firefighters in Paris rushing to put out burning heaps of trash, the garbage piling up due to an ongoing strike by rubbish collection workers. It's made easy bonfire material for protesters. Demonstrations broke out on Monday after two opposition votes of no confidence fell just short of bringing down the government. The Prime Minister narrowly escaping what would have been the first defeat of this kind since 1962. Elizabeth Bourne once again defended the pension reform in Parliament.
Mesdames et messieurs les députés. Ladies and gentlemen, with this reform, we've never gone so far in building a compromise. The government has taken all of its responsibilities, but individual adventures, tactical positioning and the fear of unpopularity have not made it possible to secure a majority.
A new round of strikes and protests has been called for this Thursday, with the unions determined to keep up the pressure from the streets on France's fragile government.
Je m'inquiète de l'état de la démocratie en France.
I worry about the state of democracy in France. It was a matter of just 9 votes in Parliament. I worry for myself and for others, and I chose a profession that I love, so working 2 more years is not an issue. But I'm thinking of people who we receive in social services, and it's really them who are the primary victims of the reforms.
The thin margin of victory in the no-confidence votes does not restore political stability, and ministers still face huge opposition to the reforms.
The political crisis is the biggest to grip France in recent memory. Multi-sector strikes, months of street protests, outrage in Parliament, no-confidence votes, calls for the President and Prime Minister to step down, and the government resorting to controversial, if constitutional, ways of passing legislation. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Police in New York, Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles are preparing for protests if former US President Donald Trump is arrested this week. Trump took to social media to urge his supporters to demonstrate. The Manhattan prosecutor may charge Trump over allegations he participated in covering up a hush money payment made to a porn star during the 2016 presidential campaign. It would be the first criminal case brought against any American president or former president.
A French journalist held hostage by Islamic militants for almost 2 years in Mali has arrived home greeted by family members and President Emmanuel Macron. Olivier Dubois was kidnapped in Mali's city of Gao in 2021. He was released on Monday and taken to Niger with a US aid worker who was freed after 6 years in captivity.
Thailand is to hold elections on May the 14th. The date was announced a day after the king dissolved parliament. The poll is expected to see the current Prime Minister, Prayut Chan-o-cha, backed by a conservative pro-military bloc, up against the opposition Pheu Thai party, led by the billionaire Shinawatra family. They would be the first elections since big pro-democracy protests in 2020.
The Japanese Prime Minister is in Ukraine on a surprise visit, the last G7 leader to do so. Fumio Kishida travelled from Kyiv to the town of Bucha and laid a wreath for civilian victims of the conflict. He's expected to meet Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky for talks.
Now, if you're having trouble staying motivated at work, it may not just be you. Surveys are finding that worker burnout is a growing trend around the globe. As our correspondent Mark New reports, it's one of the hidden costs of the post-pandemic world for both workers and businesses.
Jessica Summer was recently laid off from her job as a design researcher at a tech company. Ironically, she calls it somewhat of a relief.
I was feeling burnout already, so that gives me about 18 months to sort of figure out what it is I want to do next. And I have 2 small kids, and I'm just taking care of them, starting kindergarten, and taking a breath for a moment, yeah.
A recent global survey from the group Future Forum finds that worker burnout is at a pandemic-era high. Australia topped the list with 50% of the workforce feeling physically and emotionally exhausted. Workers from the UK and Germany followed next with 48%, and then the US at 41%. A major factor contributing to increasing burnout is a reluctance to return to the office, especially in tech and remote work-driven places like Silicon Valley.
There's a lot of hesitation to come back into work.
In an HR Digest article I read, which was based on a blind survey, 80% of tech workers were looking for other jobs. So I think that the reason behind tech worker burnout is that sometimes companies will consider the marginal cost of overworking employees being low, but fail to consider the full cost of overworking tech workers. So the full cost being that the company itself becomes less competitive and less profitable if the best talent is considering leaving the company.
While tech companies have slashed thousands of jobs in the past year, data from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce shows there are still more than 10 million job openings in the U.S., but only 5.7 million unemployed workers.
They travel all over the country, and these jobs are going unfilled, so the pressure goes on your current employees. So it becomes a retention issue, and things like the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, quiet firing are real.
The Future Forum survey also found that remote and hybrid workers are 57% more likely to say their company culture has improved over the past 2 years. Those workers also cited flexible work policies as the main factor for that improvement.
The hybrid is here to stay. And what I find when I speak to business owners is they're kind of pissed off that they have to change. They have to change. People do not want to work the way they used to. So if we as employers don't meet our employees, our valuable asset, where they want to be met, someone else will.
Bota also says it's important for companies and employees to agree on clear guidelines over the rules of what's allowed during working hours in this new era of hybrid work. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
Last month's earthquakes in Turkey have focused minds of residents and officials in the country's most populous city, Istanbul.
For years, seismologists have predicted a major earthquake will hit the city at some point in the not-too-distant future.
Now, major efforts are underway to make Istanbul as safe as possible for when that day comes. Our correspondent Mikhail Bardavid reports.
The big one is known in Turkey as the Istanbul earthquake, yet to happen. For years, seismologists have been warning that the city is due for a major earthquake before 2030, as it lies on the North Anatolian fault line. The two massive earthquakes that shook 11 provinces in southeastern Turkey on February 6, killing nearly 50,000 people, has become a wake-up call for millions in Istanbul. According to the Istanbul municipality, if this city is hit by an earthquake with a magnitude of 7.5 or higher, as predicted, at least 200,000 buildings would be destroyed. Local officials say that would likely mean at least tens of thousands of people will be killed and millions will be left homeless. Overwhelmed by reports of an expected doomsday, locals in Istanbul are frantically trying to get their building inspected. The Istanbul municipality has received over 100,000 new applications for safety checks they've been conducting across the city.
First, a scrapping process is performed on the column. Then we measure the concrete's strength by cracking it slightly. And later, we determine the thickness of the reinforcement and whether it has been subjected to corrosion. These data are entered into a special program along with the ground values. And the building's safety ratio is determined in 5 separate groups from A to E.
Gülbahar is one of the millions living in Istanbul experiencing anxiety.
We have applied for our building to be inspected, but it will take time. I'm very worried because this compound was built before the construction laws became stricter in 1999. My building also has 2 illegally built extra floors, so that concerns me.
Buildings deemed risky during inspections are marked for demolition. The municipality provides 4,500 lira, nearly $240 for temporary accommodation for people whose buildings are set to be demolished. But rent has soared in the city.
I'm having trouble sleeping. All we hear and talk about is what will happen when the earthquake happens. If my building is found to be risky, I don't know how I will afford to find a new, safe apartment. It's concerning.
As Istanbul prepares for the possibility of a devastating earthquake, residents like Gülbahar are left with uncertainty and anxiety about their safety and future. Michal Bardavid, CGTN, Istanbul.
Keep in touch with the news from China and our correspondents around Europe. Go to the Telegram app on your phone and search CGTN Europe. Follow the channel to get updates sent to you directly, as well as pictures, features and interviews.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.